Hollywood glamour often hides the bitter feuds that rage behind closed doors. Few rivalries were as venomous as the hatred Burt Lancaster harbored for Tony Curtis. These two leading men who shared the screen in multiple films could barely tolerate each other in real life. What started as professional tension evolved into a personal animosity so intense that it lasted decades. Lancaster, known for his intensity and controlling nature, found everything about Curtis insufferable. Curtis, meanwhile, grew to despise the man who made his working life miserable. This is the explosive story of two stars who detested each other with a passion that shocked Hollywood insiders. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. To understand the depth of animosity between Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis, we must first understand who these men were and what they represented in Hollywood. Burt Lancaster was the epitome of old-school Hollywood masculinity. He was a former circus acrobat who brought physical power and commanding presence to every role. Lancaster was not just an actor, but a producer and businessman who wielded enormous control over his projects. He was intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely ruthless when it came to his career. He demanded perfection from everyone around him and had little patience for those he deemed unprofessional or untalented. His screen presence was magnetic and intimidating in equal measure. Tony Curtis came from a completely different background. Born Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx to Hungarian Jewish immigrants, he had clawed his way out of poverty to become a Hollywood star. Curtis was beautiful in a way that Lancaster never was. He had classic movie star looks with piercing blue eyes and perfectly sculpted features. While Lancaster projected raw, masculine power, Curtis embodied a more refined and pretty boy appeal. He was charming, funny, and shit. He had a lightness about him that contrasted sharply with Lancaster's brooding intensity. These fundamental differences in background, appearance, and approach to their craft set the stage for inevitable conflict. The two men first worked together on the 1956 film Trapeze, a circus drama that seemed perfectly suited to Lancaster's acrobatic background. Lancaster not only starred in the film, but was also involved in its production, giving him significant control over every aspect of the project. Curtis was cast as the young, ambitious trapeze artist who comes between Lancaster and his partner, played by Gina Lollobrigida. From the very beginning of production, tensions were evident. Lancaster treated the set like his personal kingdom and expected everyone to follow his lead without question. Curtis, still relatively early in his career but confident in his abilities, did not appreciate being treated like a subordinate. Lancaster immediately looked down on Curtis. He saw him as a pretty face with limited talent who had been manufactured by the studio system. Lancaster prided himself on being a serious actor who chose challenging roles and took risks. He viewed Curtis as someone who coasted on his looks and charm without putting in real work. This contempt was evident in how Lancaster treated Curtis on set. He would criticize his acting choices, question his preparation, and make dismissive comments about his abilities in front of cast and crew. For Curtis, who was actually a more skilled actor than Lancaster gave him credit for, this treatment was humiliating and infuriating. The physical demands of trapeze added another layer of tension. Lancaster performed many of his own stunts, drawing on his circus background. He took pride in his physical abilities and used them as another way to assert dominance. Curtis, who was also athletic and performed many of his own stunts, felt low. Ike Lancaster was constantly trying to show him up. Every scene became a competition. Every stunt became a test of masculinity. The set was charged with toxic male ego, and neither man was willing to back down. But the professional conflicts were only part of the story. What really fueled Lancaster's hatred was his perception that Curtis represented everything shallow and fake about Hollywood. Lancaster saw himself as an artist and a serious filmmaker. He had started his own production company, Hecht Hill Lancaster, to have creative control over his projects. He chose films with social messages and complex characters. Curtis, meanwhile, was doing light comedies and adventure films that Lancaster considered beneath him. Never mind that Curtis was actually quite good in these roles, or that he would later prove his dramatic abilities in films like Sweet Smell of Success and The Defiant Ones. Lancaster had decided Curtis was lightweight and nothing would change his mind. Curtis, for his part, grew to genuinely hate Lancaster. It was not just professional resentment, but personal loathing. He found Lancaster to be a bully and a tyrant who used his power to make other people miserable. Curtis later said in interviews that Lancaster was one of the most difficult and unpleasant people he ever worked with in Hollywood. He described him as controlling, arrogant, and mean-spirited. The charm and warmth that Lancaster could display on screen disappeared completely in his treatment of Curtis. Every interaction was laced with condescension and contempt. The situation got worse when they reunited for the 1957 film Sweet Smell of Success. This noir drama about a corrupt newspaper columnist and a desperate press agent gave both men opportunities to show their range. Curtis played Sidney Falco, the morally compromised press agent, while Lancaster played the powerful and cruel columnist J.J. Hunsaker. The film is now considered a classic, and both performances are highly regarded, but making it was absolute torture for E.V. Eerie one involved, largely because of the Lancaster and Curtis dynamic. Director Alexander McKendrick found himself caught between two hostile stars. Lancaster was producing the film through his company, which gave him even more power than usual. He clashed with McKendrick over creative decisions and made the director's life miserable. Curtis, meanwhile, was dealing with Lancaster's constant criticism and attempts to dominate every scene. The script by Clifford Odets and Ernest Lehman was brilliant, but the atmosphere on set was poisonous. Actors and crew members dreaded going to work because they knew they would be walking into a war zone. Lancaster seemed to take particular pleasure in making Curtis uncomfortable. He would change blocking at the last minute to throw Curtis off. He would give line readings and acting notes that were the director's job to give. He would stand just off camera during Curtis close-ups and glare at him in an attempt to rattle his concentration. These were the tactics of someone who was not just professionally competitive, but personally vindictive. Curtis later said he felt like Lancaster was trying to sabotage his performance because he could not stand the idea of Curtis being good in the film. Despite the horrible working conditions, both men delivered powerful performances in Sweet Smell of Success. Curtis, in particular, surprised critics who had dismissed him as just a pretty face. His portrayal of Sidney Falco was desperate, sleazy, and oddly sympathetic. He held his own against Lancaster's dominating presence and proved he belonged in serious dramatic roles. This may have actually intensified Lancaster's dislike. Curtis had refused to be intimidated or overshadowed. He had proven that he was more than Lancaster had given him credit for. For someone as competitive and controlling as Lancaster, this was intolerable. After Sweet Smell of Success, the two men never worked together again. They had no desire to be in the same room, let alone share a screen. In interviews over the years, their mutual dislike became increasingly public. Curtis was particularly open about his feelings. He told multiple interviewers that Lancaster was a nightmare to work with and that he would never do another film with him under any circumstances. He described Lancaster as someone who had to dominate everyone around him and who could not function unless he was in complete control. Lancaster was typically more guarded in public, but those close to him knew his feelings about Curtis. He continued to dismiss Curtis as a lightweight talent who had gotten lucky with his looks. He never acknowledged the quality of Curtis' performances or gave him credit for his growth as an actor. Even as Curtis took on more challenging roles and earned critical acclaim, Lancaster refused to revise his assessment. This stubborn refusal to acknowledge Curtis' abilities suggests the depth of his animosity. It was not just about what Curtis did, but about what he represented to Lancaster. The hatred between them reflected broader tensions in Hollywood during that era. Lancaster represented the old guard, the self-made men who had fought their way to power and control. Curtis represented a newer generation of stars who were more media-savvy and willing to work within the studio system, rather than constantly fighting against it. Lancaster saw himself as an artist and rebel. He viewed Curtis as a manufactured product of studio marketing departments. These were fundamentally different approaches to fame and career building. There was also an element of class resentment in Lancaster's attitude. Despite his own working-class background as a circus performer, Lancaster had cultivated an image of sophistication and seriousness. Curtis, with his Bronx accent and ethnic background, represented the very origins Lancaster was trying to transcend. There may have been an element of self-hatred in Lancaster's contempt for Curtis. He was rejecting in Curtis the working-class ethnic roots they both shared. As both men's careers evolved, their paths diverged significantly. Lancaster continued to take on prestigious projects and produced important films. He starred in Elmer Gantry, Birdman of Alcatraz, and Atlantic City, among many others. He earned Academy Award nominations and won the Oscar for Elmer Gantry. He was taken seriously as both an actor and a filmmaker. Curtis had a more varied career with great highs and difficult lows. He delivered brilliant performances in films like Some Like It Hot and The Boston Strangler, but also took roles in lesser films to pay bills. His career trajectory was less consistently prestigious than Lancaster's, though he remained a popular star for decades. Yet Curtis may have had something Lancaster never achieved, which was the ability to laugh at himself and enjoy his fame. Curtis embraced his pin-up status and his popularity with audiences. He did not agonize over his image or constantly fight for control. He made peace with being a movie star rather than always striving to be considered a serious artist. This lightness and humor, the very qualities Lancaster despised in him, may have actually served Curtis better in the long run. He seemed happier and more at ease with himself than Lancaster ever appeared to be. The feud between Lancaster and Curtis lasted until Lancaster's death in 1994. There was never any reconciliation or softening of feelings. Curtis outlived Lancaster by 16 years, dying in 2010 at the age of 85. In his later years, Curtis continued to give interviews about his Hollywood career, and he never missed an opportunity to talk about how difficult Lancaster had been. He told these stories with a mixture of anger and dark humor, making it clear that decades had not healed the wounds or diminished his dislike. What makes the Lancaster and Curtis feud so fascinating is how it reveals the toxic masculinity and power dynamics that dominated old Hollywood. Lancaster needed to be the alpha male in every situation. He could not tolerate anyone he perceived as challenging his dominance. His hatred of Curtis was really about his need to maintain superiority and control. Curtis' refusal to be completely dominated, his insistence on holding his own despite Lancaster's bullying, made him a target for sustained hostility. The feud also reveals how personal insecurity can masquerade as professional standards. Lancaster convinced himself that his contempt for Curtis was about artistic integrity and professional excellence. In reality, it was about ego and insecurity. Curtis' good looks, charm, and growing talent threatened Lancaster in ways he could not acknowledge. So he channeled those feelings into professional criticism and personal cruelty. He made Curtis the symbol of everything wrong with Hollywood to avoid confronting his own fears and weaknesses. For anyone who has worked in a toxic environment with a bullying boss or colleague, the Lancaster and Curtis story will feel painfully familiar. Lancaster's tactics of public criticism, deliberate undermining, and constant assertion of dominance are classic workplace bullying behaviors. Curtis' experience of being talented and professional, but still subjected to relentless hostility, is something many people can relate to. The fact that this played out in glamorous Hollywood rather than an ordinary office does not change the fundamental human dynamics at work. There are lessons here about how talent and success do not necessarily make someone a good person or pleasant colleague. Lancaster was undeniably talented and accomplished. His best performances are genuinely powerful and memorable. His work as a producer helped create important films, but he was also capable of sustained cruelty towards someone he viewed as beneath him. Success and talent gave him the power to indulge his worst pulses without facing real consequences. Curtis had to endure the abuse because Lancaster held the power. The question of who was the better actor between Lancaster and Curtis is actually more complex than Lancaster would ever have admitted. Lancaster had intensity and physical presence that few could match, but Curtis had range, charm, and the ability to disappear into very different kinds of roles. Lancaster was powerful in dramas, but Curtis could do drama, comedy, action, and everything in between. Curtis' work in Some Like It Hot alone demonstrates a comic timing and willingness to take risks that Lancaster never showed. Both men were talented in different ways, and the industry was big enough for both of them. Lancaster's inability to see this and his need to diminish Curtis says more about his limitations than Curtis. In the end, the hatred between Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis stands as one of Hollywood's most bitter and enduring feuds. It was rooted in fundamental differences in personality, approach to craft, and values. It was fueled by toxic masculinity, professional competition, and personal insecurity. It resulted in years of hostility that made working conditions miserable and left lasting scars. Neither man benefited from the feud. It did not make either of them better actors or more successful. It simply poisoned their professional relationship and created unnecessary suffering. What we can take from this story is the importance of recognizing when professional criticism crosses the line into personal cruelty. We can see how power imbalances enable toxic behavior and how talented people can still be terrible colleagues. We can understand that holding grudges and nursing hatred ultimately hurts us more than the target of our animosity. Lancaster carried his contempt for Curtis for decades, and it revealed his limitations more than Curtis' hatred of loss. Lancaster was more justified as a response to genuine mistreatment, but it also kept old wounds fresh and prevented peace. If you found this deep dive into one of Hollywood's most intense feuds compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the golden age of cinema. We explore the real relationships, conflicts, and dramas that played out behind the scenes of your favorite classic films. Hit that like button if you appreciate content that goes beyond the surface glamour to reveal the complicated human beings behind the movie star images. Leave a comment below telling us which other Hollywood feuds and rivalries you want us to investigate. Should we explore the conflict between Joan Crawford and Bette Davis? The complicated relationship between Marlon Brando and his directors? The tension between studio moguls and creative talents? Let us know what fascinates you most about old Hollywood drama. Share this video with classic film enthusiasts and anyone interested in the psychology of fame, power, and creative collaboration. Turn on notifications so you never miss our new uploads. We have many more stories to tell about the golden age of Hollywood, the friendships that sustained stars through difficult times, the romances that scandalized the industry, the creative partnerships that produced masterpieces, and the bitter feuds that made enemies of people who should have been allies. The lives of Burt Lancaster, Tony Curtis, and their contemporaries continue to fascinate because they reveal timeless truths about ambition, ego, talent, and human nature. Join us as we continue exploring the hidden history behind the Hollywood legends. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video where we uncover more secrets from the golden age of cinema.